In the history of the world, if you roll the clock back 50 years, we didn't have any products with a 99.9% gross margin. 99% gross margin products are a product of modern digital networks. So Apple created a mobile network. They dematerialized everything you could hold in your hand. And that means that your VCR and your CDs and your cameras and your Polaroid photos, right? And your phones and your tape recorders, and your weather, your atlas and your maps and little books and reminders and yellow Post-it notes. All these things had energy content in them and they had a variable cost. I mean, traditionally, variable costs run anywhere from 40 to 60% of the value, preserved wealth. That it's the same challenge you'd have if you ran a family office and you were responsible for the wealth of the family. The question is, how do I preserve the value of my individual treasury or corporate treasury over time? So let's say I have $1 million. So in a hard money environment, if the currency is utterly deflationary, if the Federal Reserve or the central bank was going to print no more currency for the next decade, then I've got $1 million.
If there's a video with life lessons about economics and inflation you need to watch, it's this one. Even though we usually only post content about Bitcoin's price predictions or chart analysis on the channel, understanding fundamentals and how things work will always help you make more educated investing decisions. All experts we bring to the channel have some background on those. So today, we will have Michael Saylor, co-founder of MicroStrategy, a billion-dollar evaluated company, not just talking about Bitcoin like he usually does, but giving tremendous value on how you should protect your family's wealth. So please pay close attention and try to understand his message about how the world is changing and how that will swallow people who don't adapt.
Look, I think we start with this premise of your CEO, your job is to preserve shareholder value. Preserve wealth. That it's the same challenge you'd have if you ran a family office and you were responsible for the wealth of the family. The question is, how do I preserve the value of my individual treasury or corporate treasury over time? So let's say I have $1 million. So in a hard money environment, if the currency is utterly deflationary, if the Federal Reserve or the central bank was going to print no more currency for the next decade, then I've got $1 million. Next year, I'll have $1 million. If I'm looking at the value of my cash, my $1 million, I can presumably have it sit in an account. And a decade from now, I'll still have $1 million of purchasing power because the currency is not being devalued. Now, if the goods and services in the economy are growing at 2% a year and the currency is flat, then a fixed amount of currency is going to be chasing after an increasing amount of goods and services. In that particular case, the currency is going to appreciate in value. And so the prices are going to fall. All I have to do is just sit on the money and wait, and the economy will be larger. The value of my treasury will accrete. If the banks print 2% more currency and the economy grows 2%, then you've got a net equivalence. The value of my treasury won't accrete, but it won't dilute, right? So in theory, if you think about the good old days of the gold standard, if gold has a stock to flow of 50, then it's inflating at 2% a year. And traditionally, the economy of the world and the economy of most large countries grows about 2% a year. And so it's kind of ironic that the 2% gold inflation is offset by the 2% economic expansion, and you have a stable gold dollar or a stable amount of value. And over time, that kind of makes sense. So what happens when I start to increase the currency? If I increase the currency 5% a year, well, now will the economy grow 5% a year? If the economy grows 0% a year, the currency increases 5% a year, then I've got more money chasing after a fixed amount of products. Therefore, the price of the products have to keep going up. And they're going to go up 5%. The stuff that you're wanting to get, the scarce stuff.
And these are good examples to help you understand what Michael means.
Something that you can manufacture infinite supply of, like a copy of a Picasso, a digital copy of a Picasso, that's not going to inflate. But the actual Picasso is going to inflate to the extent that everybody in the society wants that one painting. And of course, what you see is that as you start to print more money, inflation is not distributed equally. There's not really a single inflation number. There's a vector of inflation. In fact, I can come up with this set of you really need linear algebra. You need a vector math to describe this. One set of products that are information rich with no variable cost, like a digital copy of a Picasso, and there used to be 1 million digital copies, and now there are 1 billion digital copies. And even if I print a gazillion% inflated currency, the billionth digital copy of the Picasso is not going to be any more expensive. In fact, what's going to happen with a certain bucket of goods that are high inflation, high information content is they're just going to get cheaper over time. Digital music, digital video, digital photos, digital services running on networks that have a fixed price, a fixed cost. Once you've actually paid to deploy Wi-Fi and LTE networks, and once you built the routers, and once you've built the electrical power plants, and once you've run all the fiber optic cable, that's all the fixed cost. The variable cost of deploying a Netflix movie to 1 million people is the cost of electricity. And deploying the Netflix movie to 1 billion people is the variable amount of electricity. Right? So in essence, that's got to be like 0.1% variable cost. There is no variable cost. There's no energy content in the product. That is say, oh, I mean, the perversity, right, is that it's all energy. It's 0.1% of the value of the product is energy. I'm just shipping electrons, and energy is fairly cheap. So with things like that, they're deflationary because the fixed cost is a sunk cost, which is amortized across all of the products. You've got one iPhone, you've got one television, you've got one fiber optic cable to your house. And therefore, everything I can push to the iPhone and everything I can push down the fiber optic cable, I can deliver at the variable cost of electricity, which starts to look like a product with a 99.9% gross margin. Okay, so what's interesting? Well, in the history of the world, if you roll the clock back 50 years, we didn't have any products with a 99.9% gross margin.
Let's stop here for a second. Have you ever thought about these? How has the world changed with the introduction of the internet and modern network running businesses? And we're not even talking about the blockchain or crypto here. Yet, hundreds of thousands of companies are now changing their business models to accommodate the rise of inflation by adapting new technology and having higher profit margins. And we have never seen anything like this before.
They dematerialized everything you could hold in your hand. And that means that your VCR and your CDs and your cameras and your Polaroid photos, right? And your phones and your tape recorders, and your weather, your atlas and your maps and little books and reminders and yellow Post-it notes. All these things had energy content in them and they had a variable cost I mean, traditionally, variable costs run anywhere from 40 to 60% of the value of the product. You know, you have to produce it for 60% of the retail value, and you sell it down a retail distribution channel. And eventually the true margin is like 7%, or, Walmart, 3%, whatever it is. And the other 97% gets eaten up. That's what the world looked like. And then what happened with the mobile wave, or the last decade, is Apple dematerialized all of the mobile products, or all the handheld products, and converted them from 40 to 6% variable cost to 1% variable cost. And Apple then accrued $1 trillion of value. Google did the same thing. They pretty much dematerialized every library and every piece of every book and every piece of information and every video and every home video and every VHS and all the music on the earth. And it collapsed into Google and YouTube and the like. And as it collapsed, right, this is a real library behind me, okay? I'm sitting in a library of books, and it's $100,000 worth of books in this room. Worthless. because you go get yourself a $500 iPad and you can have the entire 100,000 books. And by the way, the 100,000 books on the iPad is more valuable because they'll read themselves to you, and you can resize the font. I'll walk past like this perfect book, and it's a beautiful book, and I open it up, and it's classic, and it's like in a really small font, and I'm like, can't I pinch and zoom the book? And then I go on a trip, and I'm like, I really want to take that book, or those 10 books. They're really heavy. I leave, the books have mass, the books are static, the books have to be shelved. Someone can take the book, I might lose the book. Google took every library on earth, collapsed it, just like Apple's got their iBooks, right? They collapse these things. The variable cost goes to zero. So you have all these things that Google touched that became deflationary. Everything that Facebook touched became deflationary.
And this is a fantastic explanation and a different perspective on how products work and how things changed.
Every product you buy, it either has mass, right? Like the books have mass, or it has energy. I had to deliver the comic book to the newsstand, and I had to I was a paper boy, right, Preston? I was a paper boy growing up. And sometimes I fall into that, like, what about the paper boy? And then I realize, there's probably no paper boys left on the planet. That's not a job anymore. Like, who would deliver a paper? If I deliver a paper, you've got the mass, and that's the paper. Paper is made of titanium, by the way. Titanium dioxide is the primary element in paper. It's an opacifier. I got my start in business studying titanium. It's heavy. I remember carrying stacks of papers around. It's like 100 pounds worth of information it had to move through the supply chain. And then there's the energy, mass and energy. The energy was like me with my red wagon hauling 100 pounds of papers on a Sunday morning through the neighborhood in the freezing snow. And you got to, and at some point, my angelic mother getting up at 5 a.m. to drive the family station wagon, keeping the heat on while I haul papers through the neighborhood. I delivered them mass and energy in the news business. I expended the energy. I hauled the mass around. It was quite visceral. It was expensive. It's so expensive, by the way, that no newspaper could afford to hire an adult to do it. Hence, 12-year-old to 18-year-old high school kids hauling newspapers around on their backs. That was the world that we used to live in. And of course, now it's kind of laughable. No one's going to haul that stuff. Yeah.
And why doesn't inflation work anymore?
All the products are information and electricity. And that explains why they're trillion-dollar companies. And that explains why inflation as a metric doesn't work. It might, it's a 20th century idea, and it might have almost, but I'm not sure it ever worked, but it wasn't hideously misleading until the last decade. And the last decade, we got to the point where half of everything you're consuming is pure information with no variable cost. It's a metaphysical metric. It has no relation to reality. It's been defined almost specifically cherry-picked to define in such a way that there will never be any inflation. And so the first irony is we've decided that inflation is a bad thing. And the second decision is we've decided that inflation equals CPI. And the third, irony is we can't find any inflation. But of course, in order to really understand store of value, in order to get to the bottom of investment rationale and make rational investment decisions, you have to first go to first principles. And what I find is 95% of macroeconomists and analysts and the traditional investment community, they rely upon metaphysical abstractions that they learned early in their career or that are repeated to them over and over again by mainstream media. And because they just repeat these metaphysical abstractions long enough, they kind of convince themselves that there's some veracity to them. And there isn't any veracity to them. But the difference, and this takes me back to MIT. At MIT, they taught you to think for yourself. You're an engineer. If you're trying to solve a problem, you're expected to think for yourself. That a guy with a PhD with 20 years experience just asked you a question that nobody on earth knows the answer to, and he expects you to think for yourself and reason from first principles and solve the problem. That's the scientific way. And there's not a lot of science and there's not a lot of engineering in the modern macroeconomic landscape or with mainstream media. They just repeat tropes over and over again as though they're meaningful, and they're not.
And this is a brilliant explanation in a couple of words of what's inflation.
The way you define inflation is the rate of price appreciation in a basket of goods, services, or assets that you desire to acquire in the future.
Did you enjoy this content? Even if it's not specifically about crypto, want us to bring more curated content like this about investing, economics, and macro? Let us know in the comments below, and please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks.